Oh, it's probably you then. Okay, so I've got this new picture. Can you take 1 second to write all of the coordinate points? Again, if it doesn't help you, don't do it, but I think it's gonna be helpful, so I'm gonna take a minute, write down all of my points from this picture, okay? Because we're gonna use it for the rest of these 4 problems. Again, we're gonna do these 4 problems together, and then we'll have the other ones on the board. I see -3, 0, I see -2, 1, -1, 0, 0, -2, 1, 0, and then 2, 1, and 3, 1. All right, we're gonna do, it looks like 4 more transformations using just those points. Is everybody okay on how I got those points? Okay. I'm gonna copy mine over for the next problem. And I want you to look at letter A and tell me, what are we doing here with letter A? What are my changes?
You're gonna flip it.
We're gonna flip it. Now, remember that's inside, so we're not gonna flip it up and down, we're gonna flip it left and right. So it's gonna be flipped over the y-axis, and we're gonna mimic that by multiplying all of our x's by -1. That will mimic that flip over the y-axis. What does that 2 do to my graph?
Push it down, I mean, up to.
Up 2. And if it's helpful to you, you can think of that as y plus 2. So in this case, we're changing both the x's and the y's. We're gonna multiply all of our x's by -1. We're gonna add 2 to all of our y's. I don't care which order you do this in, because one's the x's and one's the y, you can do them in whatever order, but I'm gonna go change all of my points. I'm adding 2 to my y's first. And then I'm gonna go multiply all my x's by -1.
Is this review? We've done this before.
I think you should know this before, but this is something that we kind of all struggle with, so I always try to take a fair amount of time to go over it. Once you have those points, we're gonna go ahead and graph them. I think I can just stick it in right here. I think, Chase, maybe more to answer your question, I know that you've done this with BFFs, like absolute values. I know you've spent a lot of time on this with. I don't know if you've done it from like a funny graph like I've given to you. Have you done it from like a T-table like this?
I feel like I did like algebra 2.
Okay, maybe. Again, I feel like we've talked about this before. I don't teach algebra 2, so every so often I'm like, you guys should know this, and then you're like, we don't know this. And then I'll be like, oh, you've never seen this, and you're like, oh no, we have seen this, so I don't always know. 2. My graph's kind of shaky, I'll try to redraw it. But as you can see, we did flip it, it went across the y-axis, and I moved everything up by 2 units. Are we doing okay with that? Okay. The next problem, again, I rewrote letter B. Because I don't really want to deal with that number of times my x's right now. I rewrote it as -f of x minus 1 minus 3. What does that negative do to my graph? Flips it, good. Up and down, good, an up and down flip. It's like I'm multiplying all my y's by -1. What does that 1 do to my graph? Right 1. So I can think about adding 1 to all of my x's. And then what does that -3 do to my graph? Moves it down. And I can think of that as doing y minus 3. Now, this problem, I do have 2 things for the y. It does matter which order I do them in. Which one should I do first? What'd you say? The flip. We should do the multiplying first. Always do any multiplying first, and then you can add and subtract from there. So we're gonna multiply all the y's by -1 and then -3 from them. And then we also are gonna add 1 to the x's. It doesn't matter what order you do the y's or the x's, as long as you do them both. I copy and paste this. Put it over here. graph next to it. Okay, so add one to all my x's. And then if it's helpful, you can multiply all your y's by -1 and then -3, or you can do it all in your head. Times -1 is still 0, -3. Times -1 is -1, -3, 4, still -3. That's +2 -3 is -1. -1 -3 is. You can also look above, so all of the numbers that were like. Had a 0 as their y, they should all now be -3, so that sometimes I go back and double check my mental math, they should all be the same thing. Same thing, all my ones, if they were ones, now they're -4s. Okay, and so now I'm gonna graph all these new points. Now I'm gonna zoom out enough so you can see the original graph. I gotta do my little test. Does this make sense? It does look like I flipped it up and down, and then it does look like I moved it right and down a couple of units. So just gotta make sure that it mimics enough of what my original graph was. We hanging in there with these transformations? Okay. We ready for the next one? Okay. What's going on in this next one, letter C? Good absolute value of the y's. And then what does that +1 do to my graph? Moves it up 1 because it's outside the absolute values. Good. Do I do the absolute value first or that +1 first to my y? Absolute value. Think of the absolute value like the multiplying or like an exponent. We have to do that first. The very, very last thing is the end.
You just do whatever comes first.
Not I guess technically in this case, the multiplying always comes first, so you can think of it that way. Put this guy over here. So I'm gonna take all my y values and absolute value them. And the only one I had to change was that -2 becomes +2. And then I'm gonna add 1 to all of my y values. So 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 2, 2. Once you have those, bless you, set up your graph. We're gonna sketch. The other examples we do today are all gonna be on like a grid, so you don't have to draw your picture. And I do think it's helpful to do some practices on like an actual coordinate plane, so then you can see the stretch, you can physically see them move left and right. Here, my scale is a little different each time just because we're humans. So it's not gonna be exactly perfect. If we kind of do our, does this make sense test from before, it does look like we moved everything up 1. Remember, since we do the absolute value of our y's, there can be no negative y's. So this point that was usually like a downward point, it became an upward point so that it wasn't negative. Okay, you ready for the last one? Okay. This last one's got a lot going on here. that absolute value is around my what, X's or Y's? X's, and I know we covered this right as you were going to lunch, so I know we probably weren't listening that great, but remember that that means that our positive X's are going to be mirrored over your Y axis. Basically, I'm only gonna graph my positive X's and then I'm gonna mirror them over my axis, okay? We are gonna do that flip in a second. We will do -1 times our Y's momentarily, but I'm gonna start by just doing the absolute value of f of x. When I look at my t-table, I do not care about my negative values. I'm only going to graph these positive x's. I'm only gonna graph these positive x's and then I'm gonna flip it over the y-axis, okay? I know it's an absolute value and a bunch of us are like, oh, well, because it's an absolute value, that means that there's no negative y's. That's not true. There are negative y's, but it only happens if it came from a positive x value. 0, -2 is okay, 1, 0 is okay, 2, 1, and 3, 1. That's what my graph looks like. Okay, now I want us to take all of these points and reflect it over the y-axis. So I'm gonna make that -1 is gonna be 0, which is actually what it already is, so that's okay, that makes sense. My -2 though is not gonna, oh, actually that one makes sense too, that one mirrors exactly. The only difference right here is those 3's. Instead of -3, 0, we're gonna do -3, +1, so that it mirrors exactly. Sometimes you change more than 1 point, sometimes you only change 1 point, sometimes you don't change anything because it's exactly the same. See how it's mirrored across? Now this is just y equals f of absolute value of x. We still need to do one other part, don't we? We still need to do the flip of that. I'm gonna take all of these points and I'm just gonna flip it over my x-axis. I'm gonna multiply all my y's by negative. Do you want me to just draw it on this graph that I have, or do you want me to draw a new graph? Okay, I'll draw it in this green color. I'm gonna multiply all of these by -1, so they're gonna become positive or negative of what they were. So now I'm at +2, 0, 1, 0 stays the same, but then 2 becomes -1 and 3 becomes -1. And because we're still mirroring, we're gonna mirror all those points to the other side. So now I've got -1, 0, and then the -2 and -3 are both at -1. Now, another thing I didn't even kind of show you or give you an option to do is you could always redraw your original graph and then physically move each of those points. Just make sure if you do that, you clearly label what's your old graph, what's your new graph, so I'm grading the right thing. Okay, we have about 13 more minutes in class. What I would love for you to do, I guess at this point you could choose to work on homework, but I also think that this is a good resource as well. On the next side, it says more 1.6 practice. If you, as long as you were doing some kind of graphing for the next 13 minutes, I think that's a good use of your time, but I'll probably answer questions on this. If you notice, the first 9 are just describe what happened. So I want to know, does it move up or down? Does it move left or right? Does it stretch or shrink? Are you multiplying your y's by 2 or by -1? I think describing kind of helps us know what's going on. And then I gave you an original function right here that you can graph all of the transformations from. Okay, I'm gonna pass back any other worksheet that I have from you and your most recent test for you to look at. I do want those back though, but since I won't see you until Monday, I want you to see them before this kind of long weekend. Because in general, we did pretty good on them.
There's nothing.